Over the past decade, the West Philippine Sea went from a relatively obscure issue to a major national discourse. Under President Marcos Jr., the Philippines has been taking a far more assertive stance on the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea disputes, at least in comparison to the Duterte administration. President Marcos Jr. has made it clear that the Philippine arbitration award in the West Philippine Sea is final and binding. He has also called on ASEAN and other regional leaders to support a much more rules-based approach to the resolution and management of the South China Sea disputes, including the long-running negotiations over a code of conduct between China and the rest of ASEAN countries. But what is the history of the West Philippine Sea, particularly the Philippines' rights and claims in the West Philippine Sea? What have different Filipino administrations done throughout the decades to protect the Philippine interests in the area? And more importantly, what was the value of the Philippines Arbitration Award victory against China back in 2016? May ambag ba yan? Does it have a value for the Philippines? Was that arbitration award just a piece of trash paper, as China and some of its supporters would try to put it? Or was it more important and more consequential in helping the Philippines and smaller countries in the region to protect their interests? To better understand this issue, we're going to talk to arguably one of the leading scholars and experts on the West Philippine Sea. Joining us tonight is maritime law expert and Professor J. Batongbacal. Thank you very much, Dr. Batongbacal, for joining us.
Welcome, Richard, and thanks for inviting. This is a new show.
Yeah, I know. It's we have had so many conversations throughout the past decade, I could say, and it's been quite a pleasure really discussing, making sense out of the wild swings in Philippine foreign policy towards the West Philippine Sea. Now, speaking of wild swings, let's start with that.
Yeah.
I've been writing on the South China Sea for 10 years. You have been dealing with this for a far longer time. Were you surprised by, assuming you agree, the recalibration or repivoting that we're seeing under Ferdinand Marcos Jr.? Because if I'm not mistaken, a lot of people, not yours truly, people were suggesting, oh my goodness, if Marcos Jr. wins, it's going to be Duterte 2.0, meaning more pro-China, more problems with the US. But it doesn't look that way, does it?
Yeah, quite honestly, I was pleasantly surprised because during the campaign, he was really just echoing Duterte's statements and lines. No? But apparently that changed. No? And once he had won the presidency, there was a slow turnaround, which accelerated in recent months. No? So I guess it is a pleasant surprise for us. But on the other hand, the swing was more in line towards what we wanted for Philippine foreign policy to be under the previous administration. So I guess we're really observing very carefully. For so far, it seems like he's on the right track, and it's turning out to be a robust foreign policy for now. So we hope that this can be sustained over the next few years of his administration.
Right. So you're saying it's more of like a correction of some of the excesses or misalignments we had.
Yeah, probably that would be a good way to put it. No, certainly the radical swing under Duterte has been corrected quite a bit. No, so the question is whether this swing will go even further than say the Aquino administration at this point, but. Well, things are still developing after all, and it's still early in his administration.
I'm glad you mentioned Aquino because some would say Marcos Jr. is more like an Aquino on foreign policy than a Duterte, which is quite another interesting thing, right?
Yes.
Again, only in the Philippines, right? This kind of surprises.
Well, actually, even during Aquino's time, no, it was quite ironic that he was actually in a way defending a Marcosian legacy, the claim to the Philippine EEZ, the claim to the Kalayaan Island Group. I mean, those were all established during the regime of Marcos Sr. And he was really going all out to defend that claim. And many people don't seem to realize that, that the West Philippine Sea, as it has been designated, is actually established during the time of former President Marcos Sr.
Again, I appreciate you saying that because one reason why I was always skeptical of the second Duterte kind of arguments is the fact that I always believe Marcos Jr. because he has been living in his father's shadow, will be more like the Marcos Sr. than Tatay Digong, right? When it comes to approach to West Philippine Sea. And we very much saw that bearing out over the past year. And, we had conversation with folks, including Ambassador Romualdez, who kind of confirmed that based on his own exchanges, that the role was a cousin, obviously. Who also observed that Marcos Jr. picked a thing or two from his father. Not to mention, as heir apparent, he was very much part of the family diplomacy, including normalization of ties with Maoist China. Can you talk more about the Marcos legacy? Because when people say Marcos Sr. or just the name Marcos, it's so polarizing that it's so difficult to have a proper, objective historical analysis. I think anyone with a reasonable understanding of history knows what's happened domestically in terms of economics, human rights, and all. The evidence is out there. We're not here to debate that, but I think the black box for a lot of people is, in my opinion, a proper appreciation of actually what Marcos Sr. did for our foreign policy. I would say he was among the more astute presidents we have had, and among the smartest, I think, in the post-colonial world. If you look at Marcos Sr., he had the U.S. alliance, but at the same time, he always reached out to Maoist China. He reached out even to the Soviet Union. You can call it multi-alignment or multi-vector, which I see a lot of parallel with the sun right now. Of course, now it's a different Cold War. It's not the same Cold War. But can you tell us more about, Dr. Batongbacal, about what Marcos did for the West Philippine Sea? Why is our current understanding of West Philippine Sea very much rooted in the Marcosian approach to territorial defense?
Yeah. Well, I think you have to really look back and trace the history of Philippine
Take your
maritime
time. Yeah,
claims.
we need to do this. Yeah.
From the 1950s, we had been always claiming the so-called Treaty of Paris lines, which, while it was in the Philippine national interest, it actually did not conform with international law.
Not aligned.
Underneath all that was this need to unify the archipelago, especially the regime of the land and waters. And so the idea of the original Philippine maritime claims was to create the so-called archipelagic doctrine, which unified the lands and waters of the country. That clashed with international law because, as far as the international community was concerned, the Philippines was just a set of islands.
Right.
And the inter-island waters between many islands were the high seas, as far as the international community was concerned. So they did not consider us as a single unified unit. So in the 1960s, in the course of negotiations, repeated negotiations over the Law of the Sea Convention, the Philippine position was to push this idea of unity, and in a way they made some progress because by the 1970s they were able to convince the international community to accept the idea of the so-called archipelagic state, which established that unity of land and water. That's why that's where the international community recognized that the Philippines and other archipelagos like Indonesia could have sovereignty over their inter-island waters. These were no longer high seas, basically. They would recognize that. But of course, there came compromises. We still didn't get the maximum, which was the entire Treaty of Paris lines, which is a box.
Which is like, exactly a square
it's an
like that.
arbitrary box around the country.
If people look at the map, it clearly is not something aligned to what we understand in modern international law.
So the compromise was, we will recognize the islands as one archipelago, one unit. It basically created one big a triangular shaped land mass and mass of water and land. But from there, the international community would recognize the maritime zones under UNCLOS, so territorial seas, exclusive economic zone, and continental shelf. By that time, the concept of the exclusive economic zone was new, actually, and this was a concept that was essentially proposed by the developing countries. Okay. Again, this is in line with that drive especially for developing countries to ensure control of their natural resources, because out of the colonial experience, they were afraid that developed countries in the West would continue to exploit them. So that's why they pushed for this EEZ concept. And we thought it was a good idea.
You meant you're referring to the United Nations Convention of the Sea negotiations, right?
Yes.
So Ambassador Jalal, people from Indonesia.
In our part, it was Ambassador Arturo Tolentino.
Exactly, yeah.
Solicitor General Estelito Mendoza. At that time, they were the core of the team, and it was
for
during
the UNCLOS
I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was during the first term of Marcos that this idea started to really come together, such that when the third conference on the law of the sea opened in 1973, that was firmly under the Marcos administration already. And they pushed these ideas of, again, recognition of the archipelagic state, the exclusive economic zone, and also the expansion of the continental shelf to coincide with the EEZ. So those positions, the negotiations to really expand the Philippines' maritime jurisdiction took place during the administration of Ferdinand Marcos Sr.
Their culmination was really...
And it was when the UNCLOS was finally, finalized and open for signature.
Right.
The Philippines, under Marcos, was the one that actually signed it in 82, and then 2 years later in 84 ratified it after a long debate in the interim Batasang Pambansa at the time.
So the whole foundation of the what we claim as West Philippine Sea, and that's really a Marcos legacy, right?
Yes. And also the Kalayaan Island Group claim, which is separate.
And the infrastructure built there, right? Because among the first countries to build a modern airstrip was actually the Philippines, right? Dun sa Pag-asa, Tito Island. And then ginaya na lang ng mga Vietnamese, ginaya ng mga Taiwanese, and now, of course, the Chinese on a completely different level, right?
So, in a way, were it not for Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Making these decisions to claim the Kalayaan Island Group, to establish the Philippine EEZ, and to also ratify UNCLOS, were it not for that, I don't know, it might have taken a lot longer. Certainly, if they did not push for the concept of the archipelagic state and sovereignty over archipelagic waters, we would still be a scattered group of islands, and the inter-island waters like the Sulu Sea, the Visayan Sea, there will be pockets of high seas there.
Right. Na pwede
which the international community can do it as they wish.
Right. And that would create some weird, awkward situation for us, not to mention national security threat. Now, a little bit fast forward, and I'll come back, the baselines law, because that was another attempt to further align the Philippine claims with international law. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Bakit mahalaga yung baselines law? We're talking about the Arroyo era, no? We're jumping a little bit,
the baselines law, which was enacted in 2009, really was, well, it had long been proposed from the time that the United Nations Convention on the Law entered into force in 1994. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Senator Leticia Shahani filed the first bill to actually redraw the baselines and make it conform with UNCLOS. And that would have been its way of fulfilling the Philippines' commitment to harmonize its laws with UNCLOS. So, but basically the Congress had other priorities for a long time until 2009, when finally there was a real push to enact this new baselines law.
By push, are you referring to the joint Malaysia-Vietnamese submission? No, this is not external.
At the time, the actual motivation was, in a way, the sense of insecurity generated by the controversy during the Arroyo administration.
You mean the JMSU, the Joint Maritime Seismic
JMSU. And the fear raised that allegedly basically sold out to the Chinese.
Right.
So the reaction was to redraw the baselines to establish archipelagic baselines around these areas. But as it went through the legislative mill, cooler heads prevailed, that such kind of an action actually might still open the Philippines to protests and claims. So eventually, RA 9522 was agreed upon, and that drew the archipelagic baselines of the Philippines in accordance with UNCLOS, and also established the separate island territories of the Philippines, Bajo de Masinloc or Scarborough Shoal and Kalayaan Island Group, separate island territories entitled to their own maritime zones under UNCLOS Article 121, or the regime of islands. So that was basically the first step, probably the most important step in beginning now to really implement UNCLOS and harmonize our domestic law, as well as lay the basis for maritime zones in accordance with UNCLOS.
While the whole Marcos regime was laying down the foundation for the Philippines' claims in the West Philippine Sea, you had, prior to that, the UNCLOS negotiations, multiple rounds. Can you tell us a little bit about that? But the other dimension that I want to discuss is also how the Marcos Marcos administration's assertiveness in the West Philippine Sea also shaped America's approach to the Philippines. You had very interesting research back a few years ago, I think when you were in East-West scholar. You look at how the Nixon administration, Henry Kissinger especially, were worried that masyadong bibo si Marcos Sr. doon sa West Philippine Sea. So I know the typical attack on his tuta ng America, etc., but actually was very bibo in asserting Philippine claims. I want to understand these two things because both have to do about how post-colonial countries were very assertive in the 60s and 70s and all. One, Marcos, and then one also the post-colonial nations in general, and how that scared actually the big boys, the Americans. Can we first talk about the UNCLOS? Saan galing itong ideas ng UNCLOS? We always hear UNCLOS this, UNCLOS that. How did it come about? And do you think that the final outcome was much like kung timbangin natin, mas pabor dun sa gusto ng mga developing countries or still na-impose ng developed countries? Was this, I just want to bring this home because was this a victory for post-colonial kind of diplomacy, if I can put it that way, right?
Well, definitely, for the Philippines, definitely it was a victory because it gained a lot. No?
Right.
I go back to what we said earlier. Back then, the international community considered the Philippines as simply a set of disparate islands, each entitled to its maritime zones.
So, maliit na islands, bilog. Maliit na islands, bilog.
Inter-island waters being high seas.
Yes, ang gulo, diba? Yeah.
That also, in a way, limited the extent of the Philippines' jurisdiction to the resources, especially in the continental shelf. No?
Right.
That's basically the seabed around us. And the thing was that by the 1960s, mid-60s, late 60s, even in the Philippines, they realized that there was a lot of potential petroleum resources in areas in which the Philippines' claim might be questioned, particularly Reed Bank. Reed Bank was the most prospective for petroleum resources, but it was a bit farther away, and there was the Palawan Trough, a deep sea area, which, if you were to apply the rules back then, it could be argued that the Philippines continental shelf did not extend all the way to Reed Bank.
Correct.
It basically stopped at the Palawan Trough because that's the deep part.
Right.
I think, the Philippines at the time already had that foresight that no, we need to establish a claim to this area. So by late 60s, around 69, 68, 69, and then 70, 71, 72, the Philippines began enticing foreign petroleum exploration companies to explore Reed Bank for it. And they're particularly trying to pull in American companies.
Right.
And some American companies did bid, try to get some contracts, but it was actually not opposed, but discouraged by the U.S. because they were worried.
Yes, and this brings us to the MDT issue, right? The Mutual Defense Treaty na parating
they were worried that it might cause problems, especially with other claimants. And also, the legal aspect of it, that there were doubts as to whether the Philippines could actually claim that area of the Reed Bank.
Tapos na ba yung UNCLOS by this time? Negotiations? Hindi pa, di ba? Exactly.
At that time, it was still the 58th Geneva Convention on the Continental Shelf, which was basically
first
the
round, kind of first wave.
prevailing treaty law. But the Philippines did not sign on to it. So we were actually still depending on the Continental Shelf Doctrine from 1945, which would have limited the Continental Shelf to only waters as deep as 200 meters.
Right.
So that was clearly a problem, but the Philippines was trying to get around it. So that's why during the negotiations for UNCLOS, there was that chance now to push our jurisdiction outward. And I think that's one reason why we participated very, very diligently in all of the sessions. And we really pushed our archipelagic doctrine, the need to unify the archipelago.
Right.
We pushed the concept of archipelagic waters,
Right.
as well as basically considering the entire archipelago as the basis for measuring all of these maritime zones instead of individual islands.
Right.
So during the negotiations, nearly 10 years of negotiations, we, together with Indonesia and 3 other large archipelagic states, formed the so-called Archipelago Group,
Right.
which really pushed for this concept. It was totally new. It was innovative. It was also a bit expansive because, especially if you consider Indonesia, that's a huge archipelago with even larger bodies of water in between them. There was resistance from the maritime powers to this because their ability to pass through these inter-island waters within Southeast Asia would be threatened. But we persisted, and so we got basically concessions. No? And they recognized...
When you say we persist, was there coordination between Philippines and Indonesia?
Yes, in
like
fact,
solidarity among our scholars, ambassadors, and all.
in fact, one of the first things we did,
Interesting.
and I have a copy of the document
This is
that
very important,
was provided by Soljan Mendoza. We convened the meeting of the 5 biggest archipelagos in the world, here in Manila. And the story that is told is that they got the delegates all together, put them on one of the survey vessels of NAMRIA. Well, no, at the time it was the Bureau of Coast and Genetic Survey.
Japan?
No, this was Philippines, Indonesia,
you mean here?
Fiji.
Yeah, I thought the big boys.
Bahamas, the 5 archipelagic states.
Right.
No? Got them together, and they agreed on the fundamental archipelagic principles that they call them. No? The basic positions that they wanted to push, such as recognition of the archipelago as a unity of land and water, and the concept of archipelagic state, sovereignty over archipelagic waters, and the idea that foreign vessel passage through the archipelago should be only through designated sea lanes.
Correct.
There were 3 main points in that very short document that's signed by all the
delegates.
delegates.
What's the date again? This is 19...
this would have been, if I'm not mistaken, 75.
75.
Yeah, because UNCLOS started 73.
3-4 years into martial law.
Yeah. And the funny story was that they got all the delegates together, put them on this boat, sailed to the middle of Manila Bay to hammer out this document, and they were told that, supposedly they were told that they're not going to go back to shore until we finish this.
There's like a mafia thing. Once you get in, you cannot unless you sign the document.
It was quite funny. After all, I mean, it was. But in all seriousness, it really was groundbreaking because of those fundamental positions, and then they pushed that. No? So
very interesting. Mm-hmm.
So the one entire part of UNCLOS Part 4 on archipelagic states is totally new to international law at the time because of the efforts of these 5 principal archipelagic states, and they were led basically by the Philippines and Indonesia. Nonetheless, that attitude of the Philippines of trying to get the Americans to take a position, to make a commitment, basically to protect our troops in these areas.
To shotgun marriage them into that aspect,
Basically, we persisted. So if it didn't work then, they tried other ways.
Yeah.
So again, during the Marcos administration, what they found was that they had levers, and the lever was basically the bases.
Subic Clark,
Subic and Clark.
So this is the classic tail wagging the dog kind of situation.
Sort of, yeah. Because throughout the late 60s, early 70s, the Philippines kept trying to get the U.S. to reduce the time period of the basis agreement and also extract more and more concessions each time. No? So after 75, from 75 to 79, they basically decided that, okay, let's use the basis as leverage to get that commitment to protect the Philippine positions in the Calayan Island Group. And to a certain extent, they succeeded. No? And again, the records of the U.S. Show that, no? That eventually they decided to offer to the Philippines a little bit more clarification of the coverage of the MDT to provide some comfort to the Philippines, no? And so that's why in 79, then Secretary of State Cyrus Vance issued a letter telling the Philippines that basically, okay, even if the U.S. could not take sides as to who had sovereignty over
claims,
the Kalayaan Island group, even though they could not take a position on that, they made it clear that any attack on Philippine forces, public vessels, and aircraft anywhere in the Pacific area, no, triggers the MDT obligation. So for the Philippines, for Romulo and Marcos at the time, they took that now as sufficient assurance that, you know, anywhere our troops are, including in those areas, they would be covered by the MDT. Okay, so they were satisfied with that. Unfortunately, you know, years later, decades later, the same kinds of questions are raised about
because under Clinton, we saw the Americans very non-committal dun sa Panganiban mischief reef. And under Biden, we clearly saw, under Obama, we clearly saw on the Panatec Shoal, Scarborough Shoal. Nevertheless, in 2019, March, when Secretary Pompeo was here after the whole Hanoi Metropole, Trump, Kim visit, publicly, this is not kind of like Secretary Cyrus Vance sending something. No, publicly, Pompeo came out and said, not only Pacific, he said specifically, South China Sea, if yung mga ating tropa, yung ating mga aircrafts, vessels counter attack, automatically mag-apply ng Mutual Defense Treaty. And few months later, then U.S. Ambassador Sung Kim, in light of dun sa Reed Bank incident, sabi niya, baka potentially even gray zone, meaning militia ng China, kung matake sa mga aircrafts natin, troops natin, baka makover yan. How relevant is that? Because I notice because I think you know where I stand on this. For me, that was a big jump. And I believe once Biden adopted that, this is a new institutionalized approach by the U.S. policy establishment. I felt that's already an upgrade in a gray zone that was not certain. I call that unstrategic ambiguity, right? It was an ambiguity which is not strategic. It was creating a suboptimal outcome. We lost Mischief Reef, we lost Panatec Shoal, so something had to change. Where do you stand on this? Do you think that clarification was a significant change, or it was just a further clarification of something that was already understood in the policy circles?
I think it's a clarification that is meant more as
public signaling, diplomacy,
public signaling,
which is very important also. Of course,
especially to our politicians and our
Duterte era.
Our
this is the Duterte
public. No?
Exactly, this is the Duterte era.
The thing is, people here want things in black and white. No, they don't see the importance as well of ambiguity.
Yeah.
No? And that was necessitated by the marked change between back then, situation in the 70s, even up to the 90s, under Clinton. Even though Mischief Reef was taken, even though Scarborough Shoal was taken, the U.S. simply did not see the importance of these small, isolated islands and rocks. I mean, they were easy targets anyway. They didn't consider them as a threat. No? Because
until China started building fake islands on them. Yeah.
Until then. No?
2013.
Things changed. 2014, China started building the islands. 2015, China started actually threatening U.S. freedom of navigation interests by beginning to issue warnings against surveillance aircraft and also beginning to shadow U.S. Navy vessels, basically.
Not in Hainan, but way into the heart of the South China Sea, right?
That's when finally it became clear to the U.S. that China's intentions with respect to these islands, if they get them, would be to use them as a base for completely excluding them from the South China Sea.
Exclusion zone. Can you tell us a little bit about arbitration case? Because I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding about it. I still hear people saying PCA ruling. It was not PCA. Many people misunderstanding it as this is about sovereignty claims. It was not about sovereignty claims. Can you tell us about it? Ano yung ambag nung arbitration award na yan? In what ways has it made the situation better for the Philippines and for the region? And may ambag pa rin ba yan after all the Duterte antics? Let's just put it that way. 6 years of saying piece of paper, essentially the Chinese line. That's what he regurgitated.
Oh, definitely. With respect to your last question, definitely may ambag pa yan because you now have other countries openly declaring their support for the arbitration and invoking it against China's excessive actions in the South China Sea. So all these people saying that it's just a piece of paper, etc.
Which includes Duterte.
That's completely disproven by the
Yeah.
attitude of many countries that actually use the arbitration document, the decision.
Malaysia,
in
Indonesia,
dealing with
Vietnam,
China on
even
the South China
Taiwan.
Sea.
Yeah.
It's not just us anymore
Yeah.
who invoke it. It's all these other countries.
Right.
Okay? Now, how did that come about? Well, if you recall, in 2012, China took control of Scarborough Shoal. Okay. And the Philippines basically, of course, could not use force to take it back. The Philippines also suffered, well, it was a serious loss, not just physically, but, reputation, in terms of reputation and standing in the international community. Okay. So I guess the Aquino administration at the time decided that, okay, in order to make up for that, in order to recover it, let's use whatever means we have. And it so happened that the legal means was available. It wasn't easy. It took some convincing.
You were skeptical of it at the beginning when it came out?
At the time,
if I'm not mistaken, you were skeptical.
Yeah, I was a skeptic at the time. But, as it is with law, sometimes you'll be surprised in a way.
Good way, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the idea was, we had the disputes with China. It was huge, big, complex, many different aspects. But it was clear that there were two types of disputes: the territorial disputes, who has sovereignty over the islands, and the maritime disputes, who is entitled to all the waters around these islands, including territorial sea, but potential
the fishery
EEZ,
resources, the oil and gas, and all those resources.
Because the resources are there.
Exactly. Yeah.
And when you think about it, actually, the more important one is the maritime dispute, because that's where all the resources are.
Correct.
It's not all on those islands. It's in the waters around them. Okay. So China was claiming everything, which would leave us with practically nothing. But we were insisting, no, international law says that we are allowed or we're entitled to something,
Right.
and that is the 200-mile EEZ and continental shelf, which China conveniently
Right.
ignores. Okay. Well, we were both signatories to the same document, the UNCLOS.
And ratified it.
Yeah,
Like,
and we
both
both
of us
ratified it. In fact,
yeah.
when UNCLOS was being negotiated, China was on the side of the Philippines and other developing countries in advocating for this EEZ and expanded continental shelf. No? So it's actually unfair that after they got stronger and more powerful economically, suddenly they'll turn around on the agreement and say that no, we're entitled to something more. Okay, anyway, so the Philippines was able to take advantage of the dispute settlement provisions in UNCLOS and found a way
Right.
to hail China to court before an arbitral tribunal, essentially. No? This is an ad hoc arbitral tribunal under Annex 7 of UNCLOS.
Right.
There are people who are claiming that since the tribunal is not part of the UN or is not part of the ICJ, or it's not
You
valid.
didn't
you
need
have these
mutual
people.
consent on this.
Yeah.
There is a compulsory arbitration.
But these are all unlearned people who
or
don't
talking
understand
points
how
from a
how
certain embassy.
they don't understand how these things work. Okay, the power of the tribunal comes from UNCLOS itself. The jurisdiction of the tribunal comes from the fact that both parties ratified UNCLOS, and in so doing, they also are deemed to have submitted themselves to the dispute settlement mechanisms under UNCLOS. And with respect to the Philippines and China, it so happened that they are deemed to have agreed to arbitration as a means for settling any disputes over interpretation and application of UNCLOS. Now,
So what's the Chinese line that, but there are exemption clauses and we have invoker and exemption, but that applies if it's a sovereignty claim, right? Or something like that.
There are
And this is
various
not.
exceptions, and
Right.
the Philippines was able to successfully argue that none of the exceptions applied, because we really sort of narrowed down the issues to just the issue of entitlement to the maritime zones, particularly the EEZ and continental shelf. No? So by doing that, we were actually able to narrow down the area of the dispute first. No? China was claiming everything. no? But we were able to show that that is not legally possible. And the only thing that China can legally or properly claim is actually just the islands themselves and the territorial sea around them, which turns it into a small pocket, really. So that is the sovereignty dispute. That's the territorial dispute.
Right.
We were able to successfully argue that, that's the only thing that's legitimately disputed. With respect to the maritime dispute, the dispute over the waters around them, including the resources there, that can be resolved under UNCLOS.
Right.
Okay? And it was. And it so happened that it has been resolved in our favor. So the tribunal, of course, faced with China's non-participation, actually had to take the cudgels for China, find out all the arguments that China could raise against us.
By sifting through their scholars'
Yes, sifting
arguments,
through everything that
yeah.
had been produced so far. And despite that, they were able to find out that, China's positions are untenable. This excessive claim to the nine-dash line has no support.
Based on some historical
yeah,
myth,
it's not an old historic claim because it's fairly new.
Yeah.
And it was
from
never
Kuomintang of Taiwan.
Yeah, and it was never it never actually essentially the tribunal understood that the claim did not clearly cover the waters until around 2009. Because that was when China began acting.
The nine-dash line.
Yeah, that's when they began acting in a way that showed that they were asserting claims over the waters in excess of what was allowed by international law.
Right.
Okay. So
But of course,
it's
the
a very
Chinese
young
will say
claim.
it's not their claim. It's not their fault. It's Malaysia and Vietnam. The joint submission of extended conditional. Obviously, they will always blame someone else, right?
Yeah.
If it's not U.S., it's the Philippines. If it's not Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam. We're just clarifying this to the audience because unfortunately, there's a lot of nonsense out there, right?
Yeah.
Some people are not very learned, but some people have an interest in disinformation, unfortunately, and sometimes they do cooperate, right? Inadvertently. So I wanted to clarify this. Now, the thing is, of course, the arbitration award is not only being invoked by some of our neighbors to defend their claims, but it also gave kind of a legal justification for America's aggressively expanded freedom of navigation operations, right?
Well,
in a way, doesn't it make easier for them and also make it easier also for European countries, other countries to say, hey, see, China has no business of claiming these fake islands, so we can pass within their 24 or even 12 nautical miles in the case of US.
U.S. freedom of navigation operations began even before the tribunal
Exactly, but
issued its
the
decisions,
frequency, the aggressiveness, the number of warships.
Well, definitely, what you could say is
Isn't
that
there correlation there?
there probably is a correlation in the sense that since the time that the tribunal's decision was promulgated, the support for the U.S. position, basically became stronger legally because it wasn't just a U.S. position anymore. You had a tribunal, an independent tribunal's analysis and decision now being consistent with the U.S. views, particularly on the point that the islands in the South China Sea, which are scattered there, do not generate EEZ's continental shelf. And that the South China Sea cannot be subject, the entire South China Sea cannot be subject to any of these so-called historic claims of China. That basically means that the South China Sea is largely an area where all nations, not just the US, but everyone else, had full freedom of navigation. And that freedom can be exercised by all vessels, not just commercial, but also military vessels. So that's consistent with the U.S. position. And that's why the U.S. basically found support in the tribunal's decision.
Before ending this very nice conversation, because I still want to go back to the Marcos Jr. shift, just a slight segue. You were very much part of the Philippines' efforts to consolidate and reinforce its claims in accordance with international law on the other side, right? Benham Rights,
yes.
right? And of course, Benham Rights is for me more and more important now in light of EDCA, because some of the bases of EDCA actually have orientation towards Philippine Sea. I know everyone talks about Taiwan, but I said, by the way, don't forget, we need domain awareness also on the other side, where we're basically blind from an operational standpoint.
True.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Benham Rights? Because puro na lang tayong West Philippine Sea, but ang laki pang, mas malaki pa yung kabila, di ba? Like, what's going on there? Yeah.
Well, Benham Rice is, it's ours. I mean, the claim has already been validated by the CLCS, and there are no other claimants. Even China had to admit that, Benham Rice jurisdiction and the entitlement to the resources of the seabed there, it really is the Philippines. And they don't have any claim over that.
But they have like submarines and all passing by there, right?
Yeah, but the Benham Rice, our jurisdiction there is only over seabed resources, so any potential petroleum, possibly mineral resources, or even maybe in the future the genetic resources. Those are the ones that are assuredly ours. The use of the waters above Benham Rice is still free for all. It's, after all, part of the high seas, because the extended continental shelf jurisdiction flows only over the seabed, not the waters above the seabed. So definitely we have interest there as well, no? But the interest over the resources, probably that is something for the future, because we still need to develop the technology and the economically feasible ways of exploiting those resources. In the meantime, right now, what is going on there, what we're probably keen on observing, is the increased military activity because of China. China has been expanding its Air Force and Navy operations, no? And a lot of it is taking place in that area, that expansion, because it's a straight line to the area, the Okinawa, the Ryukyus area, where they cross through or between Taiwan and Japan. No? So any kind of military activity there should naturally be a concern of the
And that's where the EDCA is important, because it has the dimension that is not only Taiwan, but the whole Philippine Sea and that area. And I'm just surprised that no one is talking about it as much. Like, hey, meron din tayong interest doon. It's not just here in the West Philippine Sea where our limited assets are actually concentrated or over-concentrated, so I would say. Now, to close this discussion, I mean, there's so much more to discuss, but for the purpose of this episode, one of the things I keep on hearing is the reason why Marcos Jr. can have a more optimal relationship with the U.S. is because of the Duterte shock. Because Duterte, challenged the Americans and said, I'm going to go to China, that the Americans became much more open. No, so based on that narrative, Duterte was an unpleasant, in terms of approach, but in terms of outcome, actually created something better for the Philippines. Now, interestingly, some of our people would say, maybe yes, maybe no. But the other side of the argument would be, like, you could have got the same outcome minus all the bathwater, right? The baby of being more taken more seriously. And this is where I noticed that your other argument is that actually marami rin nawala sa atin nung panahon ni Duterte, especially dun sa illegal fishing in a lot of areas. Like, Duterte talked about few $1 billion of investment, which by the way never happened, from China. In the meantime, we may have lost billions of dollars of fishery resources dun sa West Philippines, among other areas, because hindi natin reinforced. Can you tell us a little bit about this? What was the cost of the Duterte approach to China in the West Philippine Sea?
Well, the cost is China has been able to achieve many of its goals, such as finishing the artificial islands without any kind of interference. I mean, they never even slowed down. Those islands are now very much operational. The naval as naval bases.
Are you saying they cared about the Philippines' reaction for that? You could say they're superpower.
At the time, when it was still under construction, certainly, if we were a lot more proactive, that might have
with our allies,
that might have slowed them down. But no, I mean, we gave them a free pass.
Exactly.
So now those islands are armed. They now have missiles and radars, etc., and they can shoot down any aircraft or sink a vessel, even up to the Sulu Sea, if I'm not mistaken, given the range and types of weapons that they have there. Our fishery resources are under huge amount of stress. Our fishermen in Zambales and Pangasinan have been complaining lately that they're not catching anything.
You're right.
And I think even our commercial fishery sector, the bigger ones, are also now concerned.
Suffering,
We're basically losing fishing grounds on the West Philippine Sea, And it's not just due to overfishing, but even economically,
Right.
it's become increasingly unprofitable for them because they can't even stay long due to the interference or the intimidation of Chinese
Right.
vessels.
The cost is just too
So
high.
the cost is high.
Which is probably part of their strategy.
Yeah, and it's what's contributing to high food prices, no? Fish,
Right. Food security.
not just scarcity, but high prices of whatever fish there is. No? And basically, a
and
loss
not
of
developing
security.
RITPAN too, right? I mean, yung
Yeah, and
Malampaya is
we're
running
losing.
out, yeah.
Definitely, no one has quantified what would be the opportunity cost.
Yeah,
basically.
Although there was a
lost,
UP
no?
Marine Science Institute that said conservatively we're looking at $600 million annual in terms of ecological damage,
Yeah,
fisheries and all. But as I said, you're not looking at the opportunity because this is just the accounting
Yeah,
cost. Opportunity cost, what oil industries, fish we could have developed. So we're
Yeah.
talking about potentially tens of billions of dollars annually.
Yeah, the
here.
fact that we were not able to develop a field 10 years ago
Right.
is impacting on our energy security now.
Right.
Like we're
brownouts, yeah.
brownouts, etc. And it's because energy supplies are so tight.
Right.
No? There's very little margin, and
Walang cushion.
that's partly because we don't have the ready supply.
We didn't develop.
Yeah.
And our neighbors are doing
Yeah.
that. Vietnam has been doing that. Indonesia's, including through Russian investments, right?
Yeah, and energy costs are much higher because now we have to keep importing. We're becoming a bit more import dependent, especially for whatever was provided by Malampaya, which was
Right.
up to 30% at one time of our energy.
Electricity, especially. Yeah.
Imagine, where are you going to find something that will
Yeah.
fill in that 30%? Because we weren't able to develop a reed bank,
Correct.
we're going to have to import it, no? Get LNG.
Right.
And to do that, you have to build new facilities.
Right.
The cost of maybe millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and
And it's
maybe
take a long
billions.
time. It will take
There's
a
the
long
delay.
Yeah.
There's the absence of policies. I mean, you had all these effects that make it more costly for us, and yet make us still leave us less secure in terms of our energy. So you have that.
Last point. What do you want to see under that? So we already saw the first year of Marcos' administration, and you're saying so far, okay, right? At least there's a correction. But what do you want to see in the next 5 years under the Marcos Jr. administration to feel more confident about the Philippines' position in the West Philippine Sea, and more broadly our maritime interests and sovereign rights?
Well, assuming they sustain this posture.
So
and
that's a
position,
wish for them to sustain. That's one wish.
Well, this is Philippine foreign
Exactly,
policy. We've seen
yeah,
it
yeah.
swing so many times.
Right.
But assuming that the basic posture is the same, no? Of really standing ground in the West Philippine Sea, I think that what is really needed now is a much longer perspective, much broader view now of
Right.
our, what is it that we value, how do we protect it, okay, and how do we do it within this geopolitical arena? No?
Right.
How do we use the geopolitical arena to our
Correct.
advantage?
Yeah.
Instead of what people are saying that we seem to be just powerless, passive
We're not.
agents. No,
We're not
we
a small country.
Yeah, we should see ourselves as an active
Yeah.
player here with opportunities, and find what is most important is to find leverage. No?
Right.
What was it? Aristotle said, "Give me a large enough lever, and I can move the world."
Right.
We have to find those kinds of levers where, even though we're a small country, we can produce outcomes, disproportionate outcomes to our advantage.
We saw that with UNCLOS, Marcos Senior time.
Yeah.
So many times in history, we saw the tail wagging the dog, or smaller countries making the most out of superpower rivalry.
Yeah.
On that note, thank you very much, Dr. Batongbacal, for
Thank you.
joining us. That just
Thank you.
shows us there's so much more to discuss,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I hope our audience appreciate the kind of a primer at least. No? So thank you very much, everyone. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify. I'm Richard Heydarian, and that is The View from Manila, where One News, all sides, all the time.